Okay, before I get completely roasted in the comments section, I understand the absolute irony of this video because in a previous video posted right up here, I said this. Number one, pick one. And this is in reference to your DAW. Now, I do stick by that advice that you should just pick a single DAW and learn to master it. And for me, it's always been Ableton. I have taught Ableton in the past for a couple of years. I use it. I find myself very comfortable inside of that DAW, but last week, I did a session with a new producer and I saw how fast this guy was building things inside of his session. I saw him flying around the screen, popping up things left and right, and I said, damn. And he was actually on Bitwig. Now, I've known of Bitwig for quite a long time. I've never tried it before, so I spent 1 week really digging in and watching as many videos as I possibly could. And yesterday, I downloaded the free trial, spent about 6.5, 7 hours inside of Bitwig. So after spending just 1 day with Bitwig, I could honestly say that I might end up switching. Well, at least for my own personal stuff. See, I do so much stuff with clients that are already inside of Ableton. I kind of have to keep going with Ableton for that sort of client work, but for my own personal work, I think I might switch over because I'm kind of blown away with how quick you can become inside of the software. Now, I've only been on it for 1 day, so I'm sure as I start to use it more and more, I'm gonna find frustrations. But in this video, I wanted to share with you the 5 things inside of Bitwig that just got me gravitating towards it every time I wanted to work on things. Now, they're simple things, but for me, these simple things add up to just becoming quicker and more efficient inside of the software, which means that when I want to get an idea out in my head, I have less steps to do, and it just makes the whole experience a lot more enjoyable. So let's jump into the video and check out what are these 5 things that I think is gonna get me to switch over to Bitwig, even though I've only been on it for 1 day. So if we look up here in the toolbar, we can see that we have 2 sessions open. If I want to switch over into a new one, I just hit this, I activate the audio engine. I can copy and paste, select anything I want from here, go over into the other session, and then paste it in. Now, in Ableton, I can only have 1 session open at a time. Now, there's workarounds where I can come in to a project right here and go into a project and let's say pick what I want out of that project and drop it in, but that's gonna bring in the entire track. So I'm gonna have to bring that in, grab the part that I want, delete everything else. If it's a big stack of instruments that I want, it's gonna all be in there. Whereas inside of Bitwig, I can just go into the actual specific section that I want, and let's say I want this section right here and I want to copy that, come back over here and just paste that in. I can do that. I can grab ideas from other sections of other songs. And even though I've only spent 1 day on the software, it's actually got me thinking a lot about how I can use this to really speed up my workflow. Let's say I have 1 session here that's the full instrumental of the track. When it's time to record vocals, I can just bounce that, open the vocal session here with all the vocal stack going on, track all the vocals in, select that group of vocals, and then come back over to the instrumental, just paste in that entire group of vocals, and then start working on the mix in that session without having to constantly close down and then reopen the other session like I would have to do inside of Ableton. So first point to Bitwig, it's a simple thing, but having multiple sessions open at the same time and accessible is, for me, a very huge benefit. Now, point number 2 is regarding the browsing experience. So inside of Ableton here, we have our typical browser over on the left. We have all of our shortcut folders here, and then all of our effects and devices right here. So let's say in this scenario, I wanted to drop in a loop. Let's say I wanted to drop in this hi-hat loop right here, but then I wanted to add, let's say, an effect to it, an effect that I didn't have already down here. As you can see, I have my tracks preload with a bunch of effects that I constantly use. But let's say there's an effect on here like a chorus that I typically don't have down here. So I hit Command F and type in, let's say, chorus ensemble, click and add it. So now let's say I wanted to go back and add more loops. I'm going to have to first come over to loops. Oh, I got to clear this out up here. Now I'm back in my loops and I can repeat the process again. And now this isn't a bad way of working. Once you get used to it, you become fairly quick. But if there's a better way of working, I'm always open to that. So let's jump over here to Bitwig and take a look at that same scenario and how it would work in Bitwig. So in Bitwig, you actually have two browsers. You have your constant browser that's over here on the right side, and then you have what's called a pop-up smart browser. So anytime you see a little plus button, it does a pop-up, and it only shows you the actual things that are applicable to inserting it on the specific track that you're working in. So if I'm here on an instrument and I click on the plus, it's going to only show me the instruments. If I'm here on an audio track and click on the plus, it's only going to show me the audio effects. Now this may seem like a small thing, but once you get used to it, it's hard to go back to the other way. Case in point, let's say I drag in this top loop right here and I wanted to add a audio effect to that. I simply click down here and then I type in whatever I want, select it, add it. Now that's added. I don't have to change my browser view over here like we did when we have a single browser pane in Ableton. This browsing experience doesn't just apply to adding in effects or adding in instruments. Now you can actually customize it based on the specific scenario that you're actually in at the moment. And a good example of this is, let's actually add a drum machine. So we just click the plus button, and since it's open space, it's going to add an instrument. And now inside of the drum machine, I've already preloaded it with a bunch of samplers here. But if I click on the sampler and then add, I'm going to automatically pull up the smart browser, and it's going to go to the folder that I specifically set up as the default for this scenario. So let's say instead of going to my overall one-shot folder, I really wanted to go to Argon Kicks right here. I could select that, right click, and go set this as the default location for this scenario. And then when we click on this again, we're going to go right to that exact spot. Now I like it to go to my overall one-shot folder, so I'm going to save this. And now when I click on this, again, it goes to that specific folder. Now let's take a look here on the drum machine. When I just have an empty cell and no sampler loaded on there, I set up this exact same scenario. So when I'm going to load in a sound into my drum machine, I click on the plus, it's going to go to that exact same location. But I could have it go to this specific folder right here if I set that as my default. So when I click here, it's going to go to that exact kick folder. But if I'm over here with a sampler and I click on that, it's going to go to that folder. So every single scenario that you could think of, you can set a custom location to speed up your workflow and go to that specific location based on that specific scenario. Now, that really speeds up the workflow, but it can actually be even faster than that when we talk about point number 3 that's really pulling me into Bitwig, is the keyboard shortcuts and the ability to customize everything. So we'll come back to this browsing scenario, but let's first take a look at how we're going to set up all of our shortcuts. So inside of the settings right here, which you can get to with either Command, comma, like every other program out there, or you just hit this little Bitwig guy right up here. And now we have access to every single thing we could possibly do inside of the program, and we can add a custom keyboard shortcut to that. So since it is my first day on the program and I am so used to Ableton, I've gone ahead and done a bunch of customized keyboard shortcuts that are the exact same as Ableton, such as when I want to mute something, I just hit 0 and that's going to mute that clip. I can change my grid by holding down Command and 1, and as you can see down here, it's going to change my grid size by going in and out of that right there. So already switching over from Ableton into Bitwig, I've made it so most of my key commands that I use on a constant basis are right there at my fingertips. But now let's go back to this browsing experience and see how the custom key commands can make the browsing experience even faster. So what we have the ability to do is use these custom key commands to access the browser and insert different things in different locations. So I have the instrument track highlighted here. Now if I hit D, it's going to shift my focus down to the lower section here and highlight this open instrument slot. I hit B to pull up the browser, And without using the mouse or anything of the sort, just the D and then B, I can now just start typing, let's say drum machine. Enter that in, and I've entered in the drum machine. Let's say I wanted to add an audio effect after that drum machine. Well, that's going to be on the track, so I'm going to hit T for track. And as you can see on the left side of the screen, it now highlighted the focus to the track. I hit B again, and I can just type in EQ and add my EQ right there. Now let's say I wanted to add a note repeat or some sort of other MIDI effect onto the same channel. I don't have to touch the mouse. I can simply hit D for device, go over twice. I select this open slot that comes before the instrument. I hit B for browse, and then I have access to all my different note effects. Let's say we want to put an ARP on there. Click OK. So the ability to use key commands to access all the different scenarios of browsing, and the fact that the pop-up browser has a smart filter feature, it really makes the workflow extremely quickly. And something that we do constantly in sessions is insert effects, insert instruments, and insert samples. So if there is a quicker way to do it, as opposed to using a single browser pane right here, I'm going to gravitate towards that. And even after just one day of using Bitwig and figuring out these key commands and getting used to them, I find it a little bit frustrating when I come back here and I have to clear out a search field and I have to select a folder again. And it's not a deal breaker for Ableton in any sort of sense, but once you get used to how quick the workflow can actually be when it's done correctly, it's really hard to actually go back to the old way and not get frustrated with it. Now, the fourth point that's really drawing me into Bitwig is this concept of hybrid tracks. You can actually have both MIDI and audio on the same track at the same time. So an example of that is that if we wanted to, let's say, take this amazing little piano loop, and I wanted to, let's say, have this chord reverse into this chord right here. So if I was in Ableton here with the exact same scenario, there's a couple of ways I could do it. Let's say I could duplicate this track, I could freeze the track, I could then flatten the track, and then I could take this section, separate it, delete these guys out, and then reverse it right there, and then I've accomplished what I need to accomplish. Another way I could do it is, let's say I could pull up a new track right here. I could have resampling, which is my default. I could solo this if there's other things open in the project. I could click here, record in. And then take this guy and reverse it. And now we've accomplished the same thing. But it does add a whole nother track to my project just for this one little reverse swell that we wanted along with the piano. And as you can see, it does take quite a few steps. Now let's take a look at how we do that over here in Bitwig. So since I can do a hybrid track with both audio and MIDI on the same channel, I'm simply going to select that chord I want to reverse, hit my Command B to bounce it in place, and I'm going to quickly just copy that over and then reverse that, and we've created the same thing. And what's happening here is it's playing the VST whenever there is MIDI right here, and then as soon as there is audio, it's going to play the audio and then go right back to triggering the VST with MIDI notes. So with all the steps over here in Ableton it took to accomplish this, we did it with about half the steps over here, and it also exists on the exact same track. Now, this isn't just for this simple effect right here. As you can see, it does open up a whole new world of possibilities where, let's say on this first note, I wanted to stutter this a little bit before I actually trigger it. So I could do the same thing, separate it, bounce it in place, and then take this note and maybe just stutter it a few times here. Or I could even, let's say, reverse this guy and reverse this guy. So as you can see, having access to the audio and MIDI on the same track really can open up a whole bunch of new creative ideas. And the audio editing inside of Bitwig is better than any other DAW I've tried. And that brings us to the fifth point of audio editing, where even after just one day of using Bitwig, I'm already starting to gravitate towards it. So let's go back into Ableton and take a look at the scenario where we're gonna make a whole song inside of Session View here. Now, I want this loop, and it's a great hi-hat loop. It's going along, but I don't want to have it just as it is. I want to do some editing and switch it up. So what we'd have to do inside Ableton is click on this loop, hit tab, drop it here, and then activate it. And let's say I just wanted a little pickup note right here. So I'm going to select that, I'm going to separate it, and I'm going to drag it over here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and consolidate it, and then click and hold on it, and then bring it back in. And I've just done that audio edit. So in order for me to do any sort of editing of audio inside of the session view, I have to bring it over into the arrange view, do my audio editing, bounce it down to a new clip, and then bring it back over into here. And it's quite a few steps, but let's go over here into Bitwig and say we're only working in the session view here. And with tab, you can change it if you want the traditional up and down look, or if you want the left and right look, which makes more sense when you're using it in conjunction with the arrange. But let's go in here so it's a true representation of apples to apples. So now let's go over and drag in a loop, and we have this loop. Now, what we find is this is actually just a clip, and there's a full audio editor down here. So I don't have to bring this over into the arrange view at all. I can just literally go down here and have access to an entire audio editing system down here. So I can duplicate that out. I can take an individual section. I can reverse it. I can cut parts out if I don't want them. I can add fades to individual sections here. So if I split this and come up, I can actually add individual fades to all these different sections that I'm editing right inside of this clip without having to go back and forth, bring it over here, do the cutting and editing, rebounce it, and then bring it back down. Now, traditionally inside of Ableton, I would shy away from doing too much work inside of the session view because I knew if I wanted to use some loops over here, which a lot of times this is predominantly used with loops, I know that I'd have to go over into the arrange, do all my editing, and bring it back. Now inside of Bitwig, the fact that I can have full access to all the audio editing down here, and that doesn't even include doing the crazy stuff with all of the operators over here where you can click and drag on probability of a note, you can have a note repeating, and that's just scratching the surface. I haven't even touched that. Again, I've only been on this software for one day, but just the fact that inside a session view, I can do all the audio editing I want without having to flip-flop in between the two screens has really made me want to go back to start using this session view a lot more and go back to creating things inside of there. So let's be honest, no DAW is absolutely perfect, and I'm sure the more I use Bitwig, there's gonna be things that come up. And it's not just all rainbows and butterflies. Right off the bat, the first thing that I don't like about it, the blocks are not somewhat transparent, where inside of Ableton, you can actually see the grid lines behind the individual blocks, which make it a lot easier to move audio around. And sometimes in Bitwig, I find myself wishing that the blocks were transparent. Maybe it could be a user setting where you could adjust the transparency, but I really miss being able to see those lines behind the blocks when I'm moving around audio. Another thing inside of Bitwig, and maybe this is something I just have to get used to, is that the pointer is also a smart tool. So you'll notice that when you drag your pointer over parts of the clip, you can actually adjust the gain of the clip. And in order to highlight different sections of the timeline, you either have to switch tools or you're going to have to go to the lower section of that. I kind of wish to start that gain tool could be turned off. It's something I'm not used to, and I find myself getting a little frustrated that it keeps popping up on the screen. I'm sure the more I use it, I may find a benefit to it, but I just wish there was the option to turn it off. And if there is an option to turn it off and you know of it, please leave that in the comments down below. Now, I'm not going to leave Ableton because 90% of my business does involve Ableton users. I go back and forth with projects all the time, not only with collaborations, but also when I'm producing on the back end for a lot of other artists out there. they want the files inside of Ableton so they can put their little touches after I'm done with it. So Ableton's gonna be sticking around, but I find now that when I go to make my own personal music that I'm not going to be doing with anybody else, I kind of want to get more into Bitwig and try it more and more. It feels inspirational to me, and I know this is just the honeymoon phase. Let's be honest, I've had it for one day and I've tried it for one day, but there's so many little things that are popping up where I'm like, that's cool, that's neat. I really like that I can customize that. Now, as I go into it more and more, I'm gonna keep pumping out the videos, so make sure you like and subscribe down below so you can get the updates that's gonna be coming out next week. The week after that, week 3, and on week 4, we'll do a full recap of everything we've learned. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, I hope it's kind of opened up your mind and made you consider the possibility of looking over here and seeing if Bitwig might be a better option for you compared to Ableton. Now, Ableton is much more established. They have a huge user base out there. But for me, if I find a better tool to get the ideas out of my head and that tool is more of a musical instrument, I don't care what the majority is using. I'm going to go with what feels better for me. So that being said, my name is Stu. This is Create, Educate, and Inspire. Like always, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I hope you go make something cool. Regardless of what DAW you might be using, just go make some music.